Got a question for you. In live radio, what is the worst thing that can happen? It's silence. It's the unforgivable sin of dead air. Now, in radio, somebody's got to be saying something all the time. Anybody can say anything as long as there's not silence. But why? Well, if someone tunes into the radio and hears nothing, they're going to turn the station. Do people still turn station? Well, you know what I mean. They go away. When there's dead air, radio stations lose their audience, and radio stations that lose their audiences go out of business. But what about at worship? My observation, from what I hear from very many people, there seems to be a mandatory no silence law for worship. And I think that's a mistake. Hi, I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTeigue, your host every day of the Catholic Current via the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Let's take a closer look. Glad you're here. In radio, there can't be silence. But what about at worship? At Mass, think back to the last Mass you were at. Think back to the last 10 Masses. Think back to the last Sunday Masses in particular, the last 100 Sunday Masses you've been at. I'm willing to bet with confidence that there was no silence at all. And nobody noticed, nobody wondered, nobody complained. And I think that's all very, very wrong. Been around, been a priest for almost 30 years, hear from a lot of priests all over the country, all over the world, especially in the West on Sunday Mass. It's the same thing. If Father's not talking, if the deacon's not talking, if the lector's not reading, there's got to be music. There's got to be organ music or piano music or guitar music. God save us all. But there must not be silence. Why? Well, a more innocent interpretation, perhaps a more naive interpretation, is that people panic because you think, oh, if there's silence, someone missed their lines. And it's like being in the junior high school drama club. You just got to keep the play going. But I suspect that if there's silence, there's a crisis. People don't know what to do with silence. Is it because someone forgot their lines? Is it because they might hear God say something? Is it because they're afraid that they might not hear God at all? It might be those things, but I'm putting my money on this. When there's silence, when no one is doing anything, that just makes the Mass that much longer. 30 seconds of silence, a minute of silence means that's another 30 seconds, another 60 seconds in church. And the business deal at St. Typicals is get them in, get them out quick. And the reason there's a war against silence is because people want Mass to be over as quickly as possible. Because after all, real life, the important stuff is out there. Let me give you some examples. Penitential rite at the beginning of the Mass. Father says, "Brethren, to prepare ourselves to celebrate the sacred mysteries, let us first call to mind our sins." Now, watch what Father does. He has asked people to call to mind their sins. That's going to take time. And I would make bold to suggest that it's best done in silence. So Father puts his head down. He starts to call to mind his sins. And the deacon next to him looks at him at horror. Father has forgotten his lines. There's silence. Mass is going to take longer. What to do? I'll save Mass. And so he blurts out, "You are sent to heal the contrite. Lord, have mercy." Well, Lord, have mercy indeed. Now, the way the story goes, the way I've heard it, Father speaks with the deacon after Mass, explaining that when we ask people to call to mind their sins, that will take time, and that is best done in silence. The deacon, the ordained cleric, who spent years in formation and study, had never heard of such a thing. Just never heard of such a thing. Now, what you might do is tell the deacon to reread, one hopes, the GIRM, the General Instruction of the Roman Missal. You know, the big red book that Father has at Mass called the Sacramentary or the Missal? Well, the first 65 pages or so is the rule book for the Mass. You can download it as a PDF anywhere online. Do that and then do a word search. When I did a word search for the word silence, it appears 22 times. So why is it in the rule book for Mass, the word silence appears 22 times, and at Mass, silence appears 0 times? Now, God bless the deacon, he was well-intentioned, probably not very well informed, or maybe he was well informed but doesn't have a very good memory. But the real enforcers of the no silence law is the liturgical army of occupation known as the musicians. Now, there are musicians who think that because they're playing music at a liturgy, they're liturgical musicians. No, they're not. A liturgical musician would know that there's an organic place for silence in worship. It's in the general instruction of the Roman Missal. It's in the long experience and wisdom of the church. But liturgical, better said, musicians at liturgy who are not liturgical musicians, they're there for entertainment and they're to move things along. And you don't want people to get restless. So they play church music. If someone isn't speaking, little keyboard, a little strumming, but no silence. Whereas the deacon, it was misapplied, well intentioned for the musicians at liturgy. Notice I didn't say liturgical musicians. It's a matter of principle because they are there to play music. They're not there to assist worship according to the mind of the church regarding the Roman rite. They're there to play music and to keep things moving along. So, for example, after the end of the second reading, maybe Father wants to sit in the chair and collect himself to get ready to proclaim the gospel and to preach. But nope, the musician is right there pounding on the keys, and the cantor is bellowing out the Alleluia because we got to keep it moving because nobody wants to be here because real life is out there. So, if the musicians at liturgy are the army of occupation, the guerrilla warriors who are uh, warring against silence, those are the people with the cell phones. I can't tell you how many times phones have gone off the most inconvenient parts of Mass, and people are actually astounded. They have no idea what's making that noise in their shirt pocket. And then they look at their phone in utter bewilderment. How did that get there? It's never done that before. And these are folks who had heard the usher before Mass say, please silence your phone. And the sign at the entrance to church regarding turn off your phone is so old, it's been there so long that the picture of the phone has an extended antenna on it. How old is that? But just absolutely oblivious, showing that there really is no preparation, no expectation of recollection, no awareness of anyone around them doing anything important. You got to get in, you got to get out, because real life is out there. Part of the problem, I think, is we've reduced the holy sacrifice of the Mass to a communion service. As the kids say at St. Typicals, you got to get the thing. So the deal is you've got your weekly anti-hell insurance, which is a subscription, and you got to renew it Saturday or Sunday. You sit in bored agony for 53 minutes, no more, ideally less. You put out one hand for the liturgical participation trophy, your liturgical proof of purchase. You've already thrown a couple of bucks in God's tip jar, and they're out of there. And when you suggest that silence is salutary It's necessary. It's required. It's part of the accumulated wisdom of the church. They look at you with absolute bewilderment. I know a priest who told me with grim frustration that he's negotiated with the powers that be at St. Typical's that while he's purifying the vessels, that's when there will be silence. But they don't understand. Well, why would you do that? It's okay, it's Father's quirk. Now, one priest I know adds insult to injury. He not only has silence when he's purifying the vessels, get this, after having offered the holy sacrifice of the Mass and receiving the body and blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ under the appearances of bread and wine, he wants to sit in the chair and commune with the one who is resident in his soul in his Eucharistic presence, maybe offer a prayer of thanksgiving. And this is where the other enforcers of the no silence law come in. This is the ushers, the ministers of hospitality. Because they got to let Father know it's over, Father. The communion service is over. People have things to do. So they throw open the doors of the church and let the traffic noise in. Because if there's silence, that means no one is doing anything, means we haven't had the final blessing, means we're not getting out there where real life is. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not talking about any one mass, I'm not talking about any one place. This is like Garrison Keillor from Lake Wobegon. It's a composite, but confirmed by parishioners and priests that I've met for decades now. And like I said, theologically, there could be the anxiety of we can't have silence because God will speak and he will say something that I don't want to hear. He might convict me of sin, ask me to make a sacrifice. Or maybe people avoid silence because theologically they're afraid that God will have nothing to say to them and will give them existential dread. That's possible. But that's, how shall we say, rare. I am sure that one of the reasons there's no silence is because no one has told the musicians or the deacon that the word silence is mentioned 22 times in the rule book for the Mass. And it's the job of the pastor to tell people that. And for reasons never made clear to me, very many pastors don't do that. I am trying to keep myself from speculating as to why that is. We're rushing through the Mass expecting that God has nothing to say to the individual heart or to the congregation as a whole. And if the sole purpose of Mass is to get the thing, renew your anti-hell insurance for another week, then sure, let's stampede out the door and get on with what the world calls real life. This is not worthy worship. It's not pleasing to God. It's not how saints are made. And that process of noise and rush and resentment to not spend one more second necessary in the presence of God, you know who that really affects very deeply? Our children and other people's children. So I want to suggest that if you're a liturgical musician, if you're a deacon, if you're a priest, if you're a pastor, if you're the parents of children, if you're in a congregation where there are other people's children in it, we need to have a serious examination of conscience. We need to read and reread the general instruction of the Roman Missal, noting the 22 times that the word silence appears. And then maybe we need to go to confession. And certainly we need to make some changes. Think on these things today. Take it to prayer. Talk about it with those you love. I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTeigue, your host every day of the Catholic Current via the Station of the Cross Catholic Radio Network. You can find all of our audio on your favorite podcast platform. Join us on Mondays and Wednesdays on YouTube at the iCatholic Radio channel for another round of Let's Take a Closer Look. Go in peace, and please do pray for me, for I am a sinner.